Hello and welcome back to my channel. Pete the Wargamer here, bringing you a miniature basing tutorial. In this video I'll be showing you how to create the woodland themed base that you see here by guiding you through its construction, painting and finishing touches. The first step is to create the scenery featured on the base. In our case we want to create a small rocky outcrop covered in a protruding tree root. So we'll be starting with the outcrop first. The material I'm using here is cork. It's really easy to use and cheap to get a hold of. This piece here was cut from a cork floor tile that you can very easily pick up in a hardware store or on Amazon. It can be cut with a reasonably sharp knife to the size you need, but it's also soft enough to be torn with your fingers, creating this uneven texture that's perfect for a rock or stone appearance. Once you have your rough shape created, pick and pluck at the sides to create a slight taper towards the top of the rock. Keep a hold of these small pieces that you pull off, as we'll be using them shortly. Once you are happy with your rough shape, you can do the same thing again. By placing two pieces of cork next to each other, we can create the appearance of cracks in the rock. With your larger cork pieces ready, you can choose your location on the base. Where you place them often depends on the miniature you'll be attaching, but I find that placing it slightly off to one side gives you greater room for positioning. You can then fix your rocks into place with some super glue before gluing down these smaller pieces of cork that you plucked earlier, and add these around and next to those larger rocks. Having these smaller pieces helps to blend the larger rocks into the flatter parts of the base and creates a little extra texture. Next up, we want to add some twisted tree roots protruding from the ground. These will help with the forest theme that we're looking to create and also provide some interesting texture on the base. To create the roots, we'll be using some putty. I've chosen Procreate for this task as I find it's easier to work with than green stuff. It's not as tacky and doesn't stick to your tools quite as much as green stuff does, but both do the same job, so the choice is entirely yours. So begin by cutting away roughly equal parts of each colour and mixing them together until you get a solid colour. Make sure you use plenty of water or Vaseline on your hands, tools and work surface to prevent any sticking. Once mixed, put this to one side for about 15 minutes to let it cure slightly, which will make it easier to work with. After the putty has firmed up a little, roll out the putty into a roughly 2mm thick sausage. Once you're happy with the thickness, you can then start to gently twist it. This should create some banding along the length that will work towards creating the appearance of a twisted and gnarled tree root. Leave this to stand for another 5 minutes or so, as you want the root to be flexible but not too soft as to damage the texture. Once this has been left to cure for a little longer, you can now apply it to your base. Lay one end of the root so that it appears to be sprouting upwards from the ground, and gently hold it in place as you place the root across your base. Once you are happy with the positioning of the root, you can then cut it to the correct length with a sharp knife. Remember to keep your fingers and tools coated in Vaseline or water to reduce the chances of the root sticking and damaging the texture we've created. For this cut end of the root, we then want to blend it into the base to create the appearance that the root is burying itself back into the ground. Using some rounded tools, smooth the cutter end into the surface of the base. Don't worry about using the exact same tools here, just whatever you have to hand. You can also use these same techniques to create an off-shooting root if you're looking to create just a little more detail. Simply have this root slightly smaller, starting from the first root rather than the ground. Once you're happy with your roots, put your base to one side and let the putty fully dry overnight before we move on to the next step. At the moment we have our root and our rocks, but the rest of the base is still lacking texture. This can easily be remedied by adding some textured paint. Now, some people prefer to use glue and fine sand for this stage, which is just as viable an option. However, I prefer to use texture paints like this, as they're incredibly simple to use and dry very quickly. This particular textured paint is Vallejo's Dark Earth, but the colour doesn't matter as we'll be painting over it later on. So apply the paste liberally across the areas not already covered. Applying the paste more thickly in some areas creates a small degree of variance in the elevation and improves realism. Once applied, give your paste a couple of hours to fully dry. Now the final touch before we start to paint is to incorporate a small skull from the Citadel skull set. Little pre-sculpted details like this really help to tie your base into whatever miniature you're placing upon it, as well as further increasing the amount of detail that the base contains. So to apply, simply pick a position, nestle into a corner is usually a good shout, and fix it into place with a little super glue. Now that we have built our base, we need to prime it so it's ready for painting. I've chosen to use black here because this paint will act as the shading within the recesses, meaning we don't need to worry about washes later on. I'm applying my primer through an airbrush, but a black aerosol primer would work just as well at this stage. The easiest way to apply colour to our base is with dry brushing. It's quick, it's easy, and it helps to bring out all that texture that we've been working so hard to create. Now, dry brushing involves loading up a fairly large brush with some paint and removing some of the excess onto a tissue or a piece of paper until only a small amount of paint remains in the bristles. The paint I'm using for this step is Deathworld Forest to give the miniature a greenish, mossy hue, but any olive drab paint would work just as well. With your dry brush ready, drag it across the base. The paint will start to accumulate onto the raised areas, leaving the black only visible in the deepest recesses. As you can see, this is very easy and quick to perform. One thing I do like to do while dry brushing is to keep my brush ever so slightly damp, as it helps to avoid that dusty texture that can often form on the flatter areas. Even though the technique is called dry brushing, having just a small amount of moisture in your bristles will give you better results. Using the same dry brushing technique as before, we want to add some browns to our base. We don't want to cover the whole Deathworld Forest completely, so don't worry if there are still patches of green mixed in with your brown. In nature, these colours often blend and mix across the landscape, so I find it's good to have a few reference photos handy when working on these kinds of things. The next dry brush is going to be applied in a slightly lighter fashion than before. This time around, we only really want to pick out the more raised parts of the base. This helps to create a stronger contrast between the lighter and darker areas, giving us some depth and detail in our base. For the rocky outcrop and smaller surrounding rocks, we want to apply some Mechanicus standard grey over them. Remember to not apply this paint too heavily and to keep the browns and greens that we applied in the previous steps still visible. Using the lighter Administratum Grey, lightly pick out the more raised edges of the rocky outcrops. Much like our earlier Baneblade Brown, this will serve to boost the sharpness of the rocks. With the painting completed, the next step is to add those finishing touches, which in this case is the foliage. The first of these is a single grass tuft. These are pre-made tufts of grass that can be found in a variety of different colours and hues from a number of different sources, but the ones I'm using here are some of the Army Painter's swamp tufts, and we'll be fixing the grass to our base with just a little super glue. To create some areas of mossy growth on your base, you'll want to get your hands on some flock. Again, I'm using some of the Army Painter's flock, and we'll be fixing this into place using some water-based glue. The choice of glue really is your own at this stage. Apply this to some of the rocks, the tree root, and also over the skull. Then, once completed, sprinkle or dip your base into your flock before tapping away the excess, leaving you with a simple, mossy appearance. The very last step involves reaching into your spice rack and pulling out some dried herbs. These work fantastically as fallen leaf litter to apply to your base. Many companies sell these kind of things, but you can get a hold of them much more cheaply by opting to use these garnishes instead. Like before, apply your glue and sprinkle over your herbs. Here I've chosen to use some mint leaves first, as they have a nice brown colour for representing older fallen leaves. Over the tops of these, I then applied some coriander, which is greener in appearance, and therefore is great for fresher looking leaves. Now, bases like this need a model to be attached to them, but the raised textures don't create a great surface in which to glue to, so we need to use some pinning. To pin your model, take a pin vise and drill a hole into the foot of your model. Attach a length of wire, I'm using millimeter thick wire here, apply a dab of super glue and fix this into the drilled hole. Then clip off the wire so that you have an inch or so left below the foot. Using the pin vise once again, drill a hole into your base, making sure it goes the full way through before feeding the wire attached to your model's foot into it. Trim any overhanging wire coming out the other end, and then you can fix this wire into place with a little more glue. This should create a nice and sturdy hold for your miniature to be attached to your scenic base. And here we have the finished base attached to our miniature. If you enjoyed this video and have suggestions for other basing schemes you would like to see me tackle in the future, then please do let me know in the comments below. If you're looking to support me in making these videos, you can do so by checking out my Patreon page, which will allow you to donate to me from as little as $1 a month. That just helps to pay for the miniatures, paints and equipment that I use to produce these videos. For anyone looking to chat about all things wargaming with others who also enjoy my channel, I've set up a Discord server which you can find a link to in the description below. And so, the only thing left to say is, thanks for watching, and goodbye.